Hey folks, Massenburg Studios here, and welcome to episode 2 of the series that I'm calling Music with Massenburg. Today we're actually going to be diving into a little bit more of the meat and potatoes behind video game music composition. I'm going to be talking about the different tools that are used during video game music composition, as well as do a video on reorchestration, and I'll explain what that is in just a little bit here. So, fasten your seatbelts folks. And if you remember this old educational video series, I invite you to consider the following. If you remember what that is, that means you're old like me. So video game music nowadays is typically done in what's called a hybrid approach. On one hand, you have real instruments played by real musicians, recorded in a real studio. And then on the other hand, you have virtual instruments, or what we call in this industry VSTs. So what VST stands for is Virtual Studio Technology. And this can really refer to any virtual plugin, whether it be virtual instruments or virtual effects. Anything that is a virtual non-hardware based piece of technology is generally referred to as a VST. In the composer world, VST normally refers to and defaults to virtual instruments. So if you hear me use that throughout this video, that's what I'm talking about. So you may be asking yourself, why not just use real instruments for everything? Which is a very valid question. Real instruments sound the best. You get the real human emotion in the playing. Why not just use real instruments for everything that's on a video game? And there's really 3 reasons why real instruments are not used all the time in video game music. The first reason, and the most obvious reason, is money and budget. As you can imagine, hiring an entire orchestra of musicians costs money. You have to pay all of those musicians for their time. You have to pay the studio space for using the studio for their time. You have to pay the sound engineer to mix and record all these different instruments. It just gets really, really expensive. Normally, the only studios that can actually afford to do an entire orchestra for the entire game are the massive AAA game studios, where they already have a multi-million-dollar budget for making these games, so they can afford to pay all these people for their time and for their efforts. The second reason is ease of use and accessibility. As you can imagine, coordinating an entire orchestra of people to get together and record something, that takes a lot of effort and energy. Whereas nowadays with VSTs, I myself literally have an entire orchestra at my fingertips. I can play any instrument I want on a keyboard, and it's just me and nobody else. That makes it a lot easier to coordinate. I can work on it whenever I have the time to do so. It just makes sense from that standpoint, and things get done a heck of a lot faster when it's just one person doing all the work. The third reason is because of advances in technology. Now, when I say the words virtual instruments, a lot of you are probably defaulting to that old $90 Casio keyboard from 1992 that has those super cheesy string sounds and the drum machine that sounds like a bunch of farts put together. That is not the case anymore in today's day and age. The companies that make these VSTs go through extreme efforts in sampling. They'll record an instrument multiple times, playing the exact same note with different lengths of notes and articulations, so long or short, or how strong the attack is at the beginning of the note. They record instruments meticulously multiple times throughout the entire accepted range of that instrument. These things sound real, which is very, very important and has helped us as composers come along a lot further without needing a full orchestra to record and implement all of our ideas. There is a massive rabbit hole of VSTs to discover out there. I can't even tell you how many different VST companies are out there, but there is a ton of them. And they'll make anything from orchestral strings to orchestral brass to orchestral percussion, synthesizers, guitars, you name it. In fact, this little background music diddle you hear underneath of me right now was all done on a single guitar VST that was absolutely free to download. It is just an incredible smorgasbord of different tools to use, and it is just the most fantastic thing for a composer like myself. All right, circling back to what I said towards the beginning of this, the hybrid approach. As I mentioned, this is a combination of real instruments played by real musicians recorded live, and then virtual instruments played in a studio on a keyboard like the one I have in front of me. The reason why the hybrid approach is done is because even though VSTs have come a long way and sound super realistic, it still misses a little bit of that human element to it, a little bit of that emotion that humans put into their playing. So with a hybrid approach, you might record a solo violinist or solo cellist, or any solo guitarist, for example, and then put that on top of virtual instruments. And what this does is it actually kind of tricks your brain into thinking that everything that you're hearing is real. As long as one or a couple elements of that song are real and the rest is virtual, your brain's going to think that it's real. So the general rule of thumb is, the more budget that a video game company has, the more real instruments they're going to use. The less budget a video game company has, the more likely they're going to use more virtual instruments. However, even AAA studios with these massive budgets to make games still opt for the hybrid approach nowadays just because of the ease of use and how great technology has come. So, where does that leave a composer like me that mainly works on indie projects right now? Well, I do a lot of virtual instruments for a lot of my projects. However, a lot of indie video game composers and also professional video game composers play a smorgasbord of different instruments to get that hybrid feel so that we don't have to necessarily hire somebody out, especially if the game doesn't have the budget for that. For example, you saw in the last video, I have all those cigar box guitars. I have that dobro that I play. I've got a couple stick dulcimers over there. I've got a couple of these Native American flutes that I play. Now, can I play these like a virtuosic musician can? Not necessarily, but I can play these well enough to get by and make it sound good and use it in my projects. So with all of that being said, let's talk about reorchestration. What reorchestration is the process of taking an already existing music composition and changing the instrumentation, changing the voicing, changing the arrangement into something different. Now, how much I change that original composition is up to me as the reorchestrator. You may be asking yourself, why am I doing reorchestration? I'll explain that here. So, on video game projects, composers are generally very few in number when you compare them to programmers or 3D artists or environmental artists, what have you. On most video game projects, there's usually only about 1 to maybe 2 or 3 composers on the entire project. Now, for AAA studios with these massive budgets, they usually have a full library of VSTs that all of these composers use. What this does is allows for consistency of sound across the entire game, and it does not matter who's composing it because they're using the same set sounds. Now, on a smaller indie project, all the composers might have different VSTs that they might be using. Some of them might be using a VST from this company, and some of them might be using a VST from this company for the same sound, let's say like orchestral strings in this example. Now, while all of these composers might be writing the same exact vibe and feel for the game, because of the inconsistencies in different VST sounds, it definitely sounds like there's more than one composer for the project. And that's not good. You want to have consistency of sound throughout the entire game. Now, on these indie games that don't have a budget, what that leads to is usually the lead sound designer and the lead composer, which is myself on this project, taking all the other composers' ideas and then reorchestrating them so that way they all consistently use the same exact VSTs, have the same sound, and have the same exact feel. Alright, talking is almost done here. So, the piece that I'm reorchestrating today is from one of the composers on a medieval RPG project that I'm working on. Now, this is an indie project, but it's a pretty massive undertaking. This game is going to end up being like a AAA size game by the time it's done. So this composer wrote this piece, which is actually an excellent piece, and I'm just taking this and reorchestrating it with the tools that I have, so that way the sound is consistent across the game. Alright, so I'm going to play the piece in its entirety that this composer sent me. It's roughly about 1 minute and 46 seconds long, so rather than seeing my wonderful mug the entire time just sitting here going like this, I'm going to put up my logo while this song plays, so please enjoy. Alright, so, very solid piece, very solid idea. I could definitely see this being used in like a trailer for this game, for example. There's honestly not a whole lot I'm going to change about this. I think the orchestration is done very well. I think the voicings are appropriate. So now it's just time to throw it into my software and see what happens with it. Alright, so I've kind of divided this piece into two separate chunks. There's that super ambient section towards the beginning of this piece, and then there's that more rhythmic driving section that's towards the end of this. I chatted with the composer, and they were really going for that Nordic style vibe for that first ambient portion of this. So I chatted with them, and I talked about maybe reorchestrating some of the instruments to potentially like a tegelharpa, which if you don't know what a tegelharpa is, it's a bowed Viking lute. Or maybe even like a Hardinger fiddle, which is another very popular Nordic instrument that is used in like Lord of the Rings, for example. I kind of messed with those. It didn't really give me the vibe that I wanted, but I did find something that actually blends those two quite well, and I'll show you what that is here. So this is called a Widerhalsi. This is actually an imaginary instrument that does not exist. This came from the mind of Hunter over at Hearth and Hollow Audio, which is a VST company. This thing is very fascinating. It's like the combination of a cello, a sitar, a tegelharpa, and a Hardinger fiddle all in one. It gets this really cool, unique sound because of the sympathetic strings that it has on it. I mean, it just has some... just a really neat, unique sound. And I feel like that's going to play the part very well in this reorchestration. I honestly think that sounds pretty darn good for what it is. One thing you may have noticed compared to the original version is that I changed the piano sound to a hammered dulcimer sound. One of the things I'm trying to do with this, since it's a medieval RPG, is keep it, I guess, as authentic as possible. So there weren't any pianos back in medieval times, so that's why I opted for a hammered dulcimer, and that's what I'm doing throughout this entire game when it comes to music. If there's ever a piano part needed, it's being played on a hammered dulcimer. Now, the next portion of the ambient section actually has some really cool chord changes that are happening. It's nothing complicated, but it is something catchy to the ear. So I wanted to accentuate those a little bit more and emphasize those changes with some movement in the bass among a couple of the other instruments as well. For the next section of this ambient portion of this track, just before we get to the big driving section, there's some really cool and interesting chords that happen. It's nothing complicated, but it is very harmonically pleasing. I thought the composer did an excellent choice with those chords, so I kept those in this. For you music nerds out there, it is the flat major 2 chord to the major 1 chord, or in this case it's called a Picardy third, since the song is originally in a minor key. I thought it was really cool. I thought it was very tasteful. I like the voicings and instruments that the original composer used, so I kept with that as much as possible. Like I said, I really enjoyed what the original composer did with that section of this piece. I added an air hu underneath of the cello, and if you're not familiar with what an air hu is, it is a Chinese bowed string instrument. It's used in ancient Chinese music. I just felt that added a nice extra little flair to this. Not that this game is based in China or has Chinese elements to it, but I just felt that that really fit the mold for what was happening. Now on to the bigger, more driving portion of this track. For this, I went with a more traditional orchestration, just like the original composer did, with high strings having the melody, there's low strings accompanying it, there's low brass, there's woodwinds. I decided to add some French horn counter melodies later on into it, and I doubled up the melody with a harp, just to give the melody a little bit more accentuation amongst all the rest of the stuff that's going on in this track. As you can probably tell, I really enjoy French horn counter melodies. So you heard the original version in its full length, so now I'm going to play you my version in Reorchestration in its full length. And just like last time, I'm just going to throw up my logo so you don't have to look at my mug the entire time it's playing. much wraps up this video. Thanks for sticking along for the ride on this one. Who knows what I'm going to do for the next video. I've got a couple ideas in my head, but we'll see what ends up happening. In the meantime, if you remember me mentioning this on my first video, the Cyberpunk Cowboy album that I did with Cigar Box Guitars is now available on all streaming platforms, so check that out in the meantime. But other than that, thanks again for being here.